say something I'm not supposed to say.
That's okay. That's the whole point.
The Islamic Republic of Iran.
Obama was the worst president in modern American history.
Our leadership today is not focused on the source of this vitriolic hatred.
What leadership do you mean when you say our leadership?
Our organization as well, in some respects.
I don't agree with you.
Welcome to Unfiltered. I have a very special guest today, the CEO of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, formerly of the Obama administration, formerly of Ethos Water. You helped start Realtor.com.
I didn't help start it, but I was there early on, before the IPO, before it really became the enormous company that it is today.
Not a lot of people realize that you have a background in the private sector prior to going into politics with the Obama administration and then the ADL. So how do you think you differ from different Jewish communal leaders or organizational leaders?
I guess probably a couple things. Number one, I originally did applied microeconomics, international economics in the Clinton years at the Commerce Department in the White House. So part of my kind of mental makeup is working on, regression analyses and studying investment trends and trying to think about where markets were moving and what will be the implications for American businesses. And then I went into business, and as you said, I was lucky to be a part of some successes, but having been an executive at two public companies, having started my own ventures, one with my old roommate from business school that, again, we sold to Starbucks, one that I incubated inside Google that we grew and sold. I've had the benefit of watching things scale, looking at how you innovate kind of existing, somewhat mature markets and find new ways to create impact and drive value. I also think that working in the West Wing, running a startup where you didn't know if you're going to make payroll the following week, having been involved in two companies that didn't work. One of my businesses didn't work out that well, and I had to lay off a bunch of people, and I ended up leaving. So I've also, it's not all success. I've had my own failures, but having the range of experiences, I think, gives me a little bit of the way I see the world might be different than my peers. When I was in business, Adam, I got trained as a product manager. So a product manager has to learn, how do you engage? How do you understand the market, for which my economics training was pretty good, but how do you understand where the market is going, engage customers, query them on what they want or what they might even need that they want, work with engineers and marketeers and salespeople to build a product that they will find value and spend money on and then continue to purchase. So having done that means I just understand the product management, product development process. I understand consumer brands. I think all that's trained me well. But at the same time, in all honesty, I came to ADL without any nonprofit experience. I came to ADL, I'm not a lawyer. I think all of my peers are attorneys or lawyers or went to law school. Certainly all my predecessors here at ADL. And I also think thirdly, Adam, I have always been, I grew up in a very Zionist household. I'm a pretty ferocious Zionist who grew up, with a bar mitzvah in a conservative household and went to synagogue. And again, before I took the job at ADL, I kept a kosher, I keep a kosher home. Again, we go to shul, we observe Shabbat. So Judaism was part of my sort of inner life. Judaism was part of my personal life. Israel was sort of, again, a family value. These are not parts of my public life. And so I think for me, whereas there's some things that I bring to the job that I think are big pluses, there's been a large learning curve for me. What does it mean to operate in the Jewish communal world? What does it mean to run a nonprofit? What does it mean to work on these issues of bigotry and discrimination that so often require more of a legal background, Adam, which I just don't have. But so what I've done here at ADL, last point, I've tried to bring what I know about building brands, what I know about launching products, what I know about delivering services in a way that creates sustained value for my customers or my users or my clients, and apply those same lessons here. And how do you work under pressure? How do you succeed in a very stressful environment? The West Wing's pretty stressful. Again, not knowing if you're going to make payroll is pretty stressful. And that actually served me well here, because this environment with this explosion of anti-Semitism has been nothing if not stressful.
So I want to ask you about your time in the West Wing and your time in the Obama administration. I want to specifically ask you about a specific policy of the Obama administrations that was extremely unpopular in Israel and that seemed to heavily go after dividing the American Jewish community, which is the JCPOA.
Mhm.
And coming from that administration to now being the head of the ADL, like, do you still think that that was the right move?
Couple things. So number one, like when I worked in the Obama administration, I worked on a domestic economic and innovation policy. So I was not involved at all
In
on the
foreign
foreign
policy.
policy side or Middle East in particular.
Do you think that's understood?
I don't know. I mean, I don't profess to be anything I'm not.
Uh-huh.
So I think, look, there's no question what you said at the top. I mean, there are lots of people who criticize ADL and who criticize me.
Uh-huh.
And indeed, one of the lines of criticism is so Jonathan Greenblatt is an Obama operative. I mean, look, I was working with a private equity firm before I got pulled in to do that job. So, I mean, the idea that I'm an Obama, I didn't work on the campaign, I wasn't involved. Obviously, it's preposterous. Nonetheless, that's out there.
Uh-huh.
And all I can do is like keep my head down and do the work, which is fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. But I took this job because I felt like it was a call to service, Adam.
Uh-huh.
I've worked for shareholders and I guess I've worked for taxpayers. Working for the Jewish people, I think, is in some ways the highest call to service. That's material because that means when I took the job, I acknowledged publicly and felt, privately, there's no kind of red team or blue team here, right? There's only the Jewish team. That's how I felt. And so one of the first consequential decisions that I made, I came out against the JCPOA. I mean, I started here in July of 2015. And then I think in August of 2015, I announced that ADL was opposed to the JCPOA. Now,
Okay.
I know that irritated a lot of my former colleagues who were very angry, who felt like I was being disloyal to the president. But again, as I said, the reason why I said what I did a minute ago is
Uh-huh.
my job wasn't to be loyal to the president or to play for the blue team. And I know the president. I mean, I worked with President Obama. I think he's a very good person. It is a fact. It is a simple statement of fact that Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror in the world. I would argue that their chief export since the revolution has been anti-Semitism and extremism. Those are their two chief exports. Not oil, not rugs, it's anti-Semitism and extremism. And I say that because it wasn't hard for me to come out against the deal,
Uh-huh.
which again, there were people in the administration and the State Department who believed that they could bring Iran into the family of nations and who believed that we needed to try to mitigate the risk of them going to breakout. But like, I thought it was a bad deal because it normalized them. It brought them into the Western world, a world that they're not ready to accept on the rest of our terms, and gave short shrift to the anti-Semitic extremism that were continuing to pump out. So for all these reasons, I came out against it. For all these reasons, I have been laser focused on calling out Iran. And with respect to what the Biden administration is doing vis-a-vis Iran, like, I'll be honest, I'm not sure I'm familiar with all the exact contours and details. We've been pretty busy with the anti-Semitism thing happening here right now.
This was happening before. I mean, like, if anything, their decisions basically have led to now two conflicts in Israel since they were elected into office.
Wait, are you trying to say there's a causal relationship between the Biden administration and like 10-7?
We had 4 years of global calm under the Trump administration.
How do you define global calm?
There was no new war that had been started during.
There was fighting between Gaza and Israel in 2019. There have been continuous conflict that have flared up.
But there was no flare of fighting while Trump was in office. That
you can look it up. I mean, the idea that somehow the Trump administration, look, I mean, I will be the first one to say the Abraham Accords were incredibly important. Opening the embassy in Jerusalem, I attended the opening. I thought it was incredibly important. Recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights was incredibly important. But like, look, war was raging in Syria. The fact of the matter is, Adam, there wasn't global calm. I mean, there was still fighting raging there. And maybe if President Trump had engaged there in a decisive way, you could have pushed back on the IRGC forces and the Syrian forces. I mean, they went in and continued to fight ISIS on the ground, but they didn't do anything to challenge the expanding Russian and Iranian hegemony in Syria. So, like, I don't know how you define global calm, but for me, like, war and people getting killed is not global calm. Whereas the Syria civil war, the Arab Spring, and what became the Syrian civil war started, whatever it was, in like 2009, I think, or 2010, during
Right.
when President Obama was in office. It continued to rage when President Trump was in office. I don't know how that's not calm.
The war in Syria, at least when Trump got into office, Israel started taking a much larger approach in terms of their airstrikes into Syria. And throughout that time period, the civil war did, die down. I mean, the civil war ended prior to, I mean, if you want to even call it ending, but it did end prior to Biden coming into office. So, I mean, I do think there is some type of correlation with the instability and the emerging conflicts that we've seen over the last couple of years in relation to the Democratic Party's foreign
I
policy.
really don't think. I think it is a major leap to blame the Democratic Party for what Putin did in Ukraine
Mhm.
and for what Hamas did the day that they did it. I mean, I think the truth is that all of the signs were pointing toward the rapprochement between Saudi and Israel being codified in some kind of extension or new chapter of the Abraham Accords. And I think more than anything, that's what prompted the Hamas attack on 10/7.
Oh, had just propped up Iran and agreed to give them a significant amount of money, and we're ratifying a new international agreement with them. So I mean, like,
That's
and that
true.
was
Like,
a
wait a
huge.
second, where are you getting these facts from? Like, it's
Well,
not true that prior to 10, maybe you can correct me and point me to the source, but I am not aware that prior to 10/7, quote, the Biden administration was propping up the Iranian regime.
were they
Where are
doing
you
it?
getting that from?
Well, I mean, they relieved sanctions, and I mean, clearly they were not looking to cripple the regime the way the Trump administration was. I mean, that's a very clear thing. They re-entered negotiations to restart a deal that was being discussed for months. That was something very public. I mean, it's not really about, to me, it's not really about partisanship or Democrat or Republican. It's about what is smart policy and what is good for the United States, and how in any way, shape, or form does the party of the far left and progressives, who are the champions of, I guess you could say, socialism, progressivism, equal love, and probably the party of the LGBTQ community, how is not completely and utterly destroying an eschatological apocalyptic regime, not in the, I guess you could say, benefit of not only the American people, but the global calm and their greatest ally in the Middle East. I mean, the change in language recently from this administration and from Chuck Schumer and AOC and the rest of the representatives of their party, it does ask a question, what the is going on, and who the is interpreting what's going on in the geopolitical field, in my opinion.
You're linking a lot of things here. So, with respect to the moment we're in right now, we have continually pushed back on this claim that Israel is committing genocide, because it isn't. It's a blood libel. It's fact.
No, you have to have intent to commit genocide.
My job is to protect the Jewish people. My job is to fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. And so I think anyone who engages in blood libel, anyone who engages in pushing anti-Semitic tropes, anyone who engages in, delegitimizing our community, whether it's our religion or ethnicity, our state, whatever, it creates real challenges for me in the day-to-day work that ADL does, which is, again, on the ground in communities all over the country, dealing with people who are victimized by anti-Semitic hate and harassment, people whose homes or businesses have been vandalized, people who've been cyber stalked or otherwise kind of attacked online, people who've been assaulted, who've lost loved ones, who've been murdered. I mean, this is what I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So all of this is very challenging.
So let me ask you a question, because you bring all of that up, and one of the things that you guys kind of put your seal of approval on was the Biden administration's anti-Semitism policy that came out about 4 months before the war. And if you read the policy, it was about 60 pages. It mentioned Islamophobia 17 times. It did not mention anti-Zionism once. It did not use the word Israel once. And it did not use the word Zionism once. And it mentioned white supremacy about 10 times. And the surge of anti-Semitism that's gone up about 383% since October 7th is not the type of anti-Semitism that the policy was meant to address.
So number one, the National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism is a historic document. It's the first time in 250 plus years of the Republic that anti-Semitism has been prioritized at the national level. When I say prioritized at the national level, means it's been elevated among White House priorities like fighting climate change or saving the auto industry or, spurring job growth. That is in and of itself meaningful. Now, we pushed for the White House, and we pushed for a lot of what's in there. And there's no silver bullet. There are hundreds of recommendations for the federal government to undertake, the executive and legislative level, for the private sector, civil society, state and local governments. But we pushed for the IRA definition to be adopted wholesale. It wasn't. We publicly said that we wanted that to happen. It didn't. They embraced it, but they didn't, quote, formally adopt it. The U.S. State Department uses it. It's been using it for a long time. The U.S. Department of Education is using it to undertake these Title VI claims. Nonetheless, while the document doesn't call out anti-Zionism specifically, and again, I wish that it had, the truth is that it calls out anti-Semitism. It doesn't say this anti-Semitism is less important or more important than that anti-Semitism. It calls out people who hate Jews. And it's
it seems more like a document about Islamophobia and white supremacy.
Step back. So it's 60 plus pages. Islamophobia is mentioned how many times?
17 times.
How many times is the word anti-Semitism mentioned?
It's mentioned a number of times in a specific lens of anti-Semitism. I think that, I think one of the biggest mistakes of the Obama administration and the Trump administration was that they wouldn't acknowledge either side's extremism. Trump would never say white supremacy, which I think was a huge, huge mistake. And Obama would never say radical Islam. And I think that's kind of like what I'm getting at here, is that it really came off like a partisan document that, while it used the idea of highlighting anti-Semitism to a national agenda, it really didn't address the actual problem of anti-Semitism, because it was only looking at one lens of it, and you can't really address a problem unless
I just don't agree with you. I don't agree with you.
Well, what is there not to agree about when it doesn't address progressive anti-national anti-Zionism, which is the actual type of anti-Semitism that you guys are dealing with now?
When it talks about giving more resources to the U.S. Department of Education to deal with Title VI claims, it doesn't say Title VI claims that are rooted in white supremacist motivated anti-Semitism. It also doesn't say anti-Zionist motivated anti-Semitism. It also doesn't say political Islamist anti-Semitism. It just says anti-Semitism.
Right, but it does mention white supremacy a number of times, and it never meant, I just don't understand how you can have a modern anti-Semitism policy without mentioning anti-Zionism or Israel. Our leadership today is not as focused on the actual source of this vitriolic hatred and stopping it at its core, if that makes sense.
What leadership do you mean when you say our leadership?
I mean our political leadership. I mean federations. I mean Hillel executives. I would say your organization as well in some respects.
I can't speak for the White House. I can't speak for the Democratic Party. I can't speak for all Jewish communal organizations. All I can speak for is ADL and myself. I don't think anyone would look at our statements and say that we are soft pedaling it on the different kinds of anti-Semitism that are out there. You can look at our website, you can look at our social media output, you can read our analyses, you can look at my speeches. We're pretty clear-eyed about the threats, where they're coming from. We started this conversation with Iran. We have been outspoken and out in front and calling out the Islamic Republic. for the span of its activities. Again, I don't deal with everything under the sun. I deal with anti-Semitism, the major focus here in the US. But I would really say, I mean, we're pretty clear-eyed about it. We have strategies. We don't just look at why it's happening. We try to look at how to solve it. Again, I think you need to measure it and study it in order to be effectively diagnostic and then prescriptive about how to address it. Again, and out in front and calling out the Islamic Republic for the span of its activities. Again, I don't deal with everything under the sun. I deal with anti-Semitism, the major focus here in the US. So there are different organizations doing different things, but the comment on industry, like for me in industry, having been in like tech or having been in media, having been in CPG, it's a set of businesses that are designed, to drive profit, for the benefit of investors or shareholders, and to deliver a quality product or service to their customers or consumers. And the goal of the industry is to grow and keep making money. My goal at ADL is to stop anti-Semitism. I mean, success for me is to close the ADL. Success for me is to solve the problem. But like we've been talking about this for years and pushing. And so like ADL historically wasn't on college campuses. That's not what we've done. We have now partnered in the last 3 years, with Hillel, with Chabad on campus, with AEPI, with ZBT, right? We're doing that in order to go to the place where the problem is, because we weren't there before. There were groups who were operating on campus, none of which I'm going to denigrate because I don't think that's helpful. But I think there's a need for us to get our services there. So that's what we're doing right now.
Do you feel that there's a possibility of some type of attack that could happen on American soil towards?
Definitely, 100%. Like I think if you just look at what's happening, again, we were talking about campuses a moment ago. The level of vitriol directed against our students is bananas. We had a situation about a month ago at Berkeley where 2 students were assaulted by 2 Jewish women. They were hosting an IDF reservist, and they were assaulted by this throng, this mob of like pro-Hamas activists, almost all of whom were wearing keffiyehs to cover their whole faces, or it was at night. It was at nighttime, on a Sunday night. They were wearing sunglasses and baseball caps and like scarves or bandanas around their faces. I mean, like it was a bank robbery, not like it was a speaker. And these 2 women were assaulted. No one's been arrested, let alone the school's taking no disciplinary action. This past weekend, on March the 23rd, I think it was, or 24th, in Ann Arbor, there was the convocation, which is a university-wide event. And the anti-Israel protesters interfered with it, disrupted it. And instead of taking them out of the room, which they didn't do, instead of suspending them, which they didn't do, they just stopped the convocation and gave in to these lunatics. By the way, a couple days earlier, the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at UMichigan announced, I can't remember the exact quote, but she basically said something like, "Death to all the Zionists," or "I wish for death and worse." Not expelled, not suspended, no disciplinary action. So in an environment in which extremists feel emboldened, in which people in positions of authority are not taking action, which they're allowing them to like, I mean, it's hard for me to describe these behaviors as anything other than incitement, right? Because that's what it is. And incitement is not protected speech in America. Like, of course, we're setting the ground for something far worse. I mean, I'm very worried about Rafah. The IDF needs to go into Rafah to rescue the hostages, to root out Hamas. But I'm worried that the pro-Hamas forces in America will try to use that as a pretext to do something even more disruptive, even more violent on our streets.
Getting back to, the partisanship, that's the thing that scares me. And I think that's the thing that is swaying voters now. And I'm bringing up these topics because I think it's very important, because I think that a lot of people are in decision mode right now because they're deciding who they're going to vote for president of the United States. And a lot of Jewish Americans are very concerned with the change in language out of this administration. How do you feel like this hyper-partisanization is affecting the Jewish community? Because I think it's having a very negative effect. I think it's really harming the way we're fighting anti-Semitism. And I think it's increasing the argument for the pro-Hamas groups, like you just said.
Look, I'm deeply worried about partisanship. I'm deeply worried about the kind of fissures in the Democratic Party. You mentioned what Senate Leader Schumer said a couple weeks ago, which I found, some of which I agreed with, much of which I found very problematic. I don't understand how US politicians call for regime change in Israel and not regime change in Iran. Look, Iran policy has been screwed up in this country for a very long time. Arguably the best thing that President Trump did, in addition to the Abraham Accords, was taking out Qasem Soleimani. It's an arch terrorist and kind of one of the worst, if not the worst actor on the Middle East stage. But on the other hand, I mean, the truth is that the Iranian nuclear project continues unabated. Support for Iranian proxies, unfortunately, continues unabated. And I think we're in a very alarming place. I really agree with Naftali Bennett's formulation, which is that he called it the octopus strategy. Stop fighting the tentacles. We need more of that because look, right around the corner is Al-Quds Day. That is this kind of faux holiday that the Islamic Republic created after the revolution to, attack Israel. I mean, it's a global day where Shia Muslims and increasingly other Muslim, Sunni and other Muslims simply just rant about Israel. I mean, it's just despicable and loathsome. And so I'm very alarmed about what could come, which is why we're pushing so hard for law enforcement in the United States to take precautions to make sure that our synagogues, that our JCCs, that our day schools, that all our institutions are adequately protected, and that the groups who are pushing this kind of baloney get dealt with appropriately.
So let me ask you a question because I find that very interesting. Do you think it is good enough for the Jewish community today to rely on outside sources to protect themselves?
I think defense requires a multidimensional strategy, right? There's a role for law enforcement to play. There's a role for tech companies to play. There's a role for our own institutions to play. There's a role for policy. So I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think we can't just put all our faith and our fates in the hands of, the local police, or the FBI, or Facebook, or Elon Musk, or the Biden White House, or I don't know, whatever. Or President Ono at Michigan. It requires it's an all hands on deck task. It requires all of us to push for everyone to be doing the right things.
But the one thing that I didn't hear from you, which I find interesting, was that you didn't talk about self-defense in our own community.
We partner with a group called CSS. I don't know if you know who they are, Community Security Services. They're the largest volunteer force in the Jewish community today. Their people are trained in Krav Maga and other martial arts. They do weekly and monthly trainings for their volunteers to provide, again, from inside the community, protection for synagogues and day schools and JCCs. We provide them with threat analysis and intelligence and reporting. So we believe in it, we're investing in it, but ADL directly doesn't do that. So we believe in it, though. We work with.
I mean, don't you think, though, for fighting anti-Semitism, maybe now is the time to start bringing over young Israelis to empower young Jews to make sure that we have a secure, defensible, not only mentally but physically community?
We work with Jaffe, the Jewish Agency for Israel. We work with CSS. I mean, it might not be our expertise, but we would provide what we can, like in a value-added relationship, Adam, to help those who can do it to do it. And I think it's very valuable. Again, nobody should be so self-assured that they think they got the answer. Nobody has the answer. It requires all of us and a great deal of humility. Like you said before, I mean, we haven't solved this problem. I mean, it's still raging. So
I just want to thank Jonathan Greenblatt for joining me, CEO of the ADL and fighter for the Jewish people and the leader in the fight against anti-Semitism in North America. I want to thank him so much for joining with me. I always have a great time getting to speak with him. He still hasn't had a drink with me, which he needs to do.
We'll do that when I'm next in Israel.
Yeah, or when I'm next in New York. Just want to thank everybody for watching, and we will see you next week.